Since some of you have been requesting some positive content for the channel, I figured why not review the sequel to one of my favorite edgy games of my teenage years, Darksiders. I remember stating in my review of the original game that I didn't quite like the second game as much. It made a lot of big changes to the Darksiders formula, and somewhere along the way lost some of its identity. Now, some of you may be thinking, if you're familiar with the series, that Darksiders never really had a strong identity. It was best known as a hybrid Zelda and God of War clone. But I think the combination of those gameplay styles plus its unique setting did give it somewhat of an identity, even if the actual gameplay experience could easily be molded into something else. And the original game was certainly flawed in quite a few ways, and so I can see why people prefer this sequel, but when I played it originally back when it came out a decade ago, I just remember thinking that it felt quite a bit more shallow and generic than the last game. Now the question is, has my opinion changed? Are you guys right? Is this the best game in the franchise? Well, for once, I won't spoil my final thoughts in the intro. You'll have to watch the video to find out. And if you like these positive reviews, remember to give them a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. God, I hate saying that. And of course, try and get some other people to watch these, because if this gets less than 50,000 views in a week, you forfeit the right to complain about my channel being constantly negative. So without further ado, let's once again dive into the edge-kino world of Darksiders. Now, I'm sure the question on some people's mind is, what exactly is Darksiders? It was never really that popular a series. I will forgive you for having forgotten about it, especially when the third and fourth entries were pretty forgettable. Not that I ever played the fourth, just one look at it told me that I knew I wouldn't be interested. Well, Darksiders is essentially about the apocalypse and pseudo-Christianity. The creator, aka God, obviously, created angels, demons, the council, which maintains the balance between good and evil, and humanity, and one day, during the apocalypse, they would fight over Eden. Well, the beginning of the first game establishes that War, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, marches on Earth too early, which allows the angels and demons to also enter Earth, and they completely wipe out humanity. And so, War goes on this grand quest to try and fix things and prove his innocence, and ultimately defeat the demons that have destroyed Earth. And over the course of the game, we are posed this mystery. Who is the Destroyer? Well, we find out near the end that a mysterious force corrupted Abaddon, the leader of the Hellguard Angels, and turned him into this giant dragon demon that is the Destroyer. And so the council needed to assassinate him, but needed a good reason to do it, and so they faked the seals being broken to send War to Earth and then punished him for 100 years, which would motivate him enough to get vengeance on Earth. And as a nice little cherry on top, they also set him up to die, and so once you defeat the Destroyer at the end of the game, one of the council's servants, who has been attached to you since the beginning of the game and was limiting your power, tries to kill War, but Uriel ends up killing War instead, fulfilling a death oath that was made way earlier in the game, and then breaks the seventh seal herself, which for some reason brings War back to life. I guess because it summons the four horsemen magically, and then you kill the Watcher, and the game ends with the four horsemen being summoned together.
You will be hunted. The White City for certain. The Council, and there will be others. You would wage this war alone?
No. Not alone.
To this day, we still have not seen this story continued. Every other sequel has simply built up to it. Instead, Darksiders 2 is a prequel and an interquel. It takes place during the events of Darksiders 1 and slightly before, as Death, obviously another one of the four horsemen, and the most powerful of the four, goes on his own epic quest to try and prove his brother's innocence and bring back humanity from the dead by seeking out the Tree of Life and later the Well of Souls. As I said in the intro, Darksiders was a hybrid of Legend of Zelda and God of War. You explore this semi-linear world, go to various dungeons across each corner of the apocalyptic Earth that has been somewhat terraformed by the demons, which gave the game a pretty interesting aesthetic as far as apocalypses go. I really liked the look of that game. And the actual Zelda dungeons, while not really holding up to many of the real Zelda games' dungeons and puzzles, and generally Nintendo's really great level design, were still solid in their own right. They all felt somewhat unique. The weaker part of the game was always the God of War elements. The combat in the first game was really not good. It wasn't terrible, it still felt good to hit enemies, but it was so simplistic and so unbalanced that you could spam the same combo the entire game and do completely fine. And it wasn't like the combo was hard to do, it was just square, wait half a second, and then hit square 3 more times. That one combo does more damage than anything else in the entire game. There was no reason for the secondary weapons, and even the Wrath abilities were probably unnecessary unless you're playing on the highest difficulty. That said, I will defend Darksiders 1 because nobody plays Zelda games for the combat. The only reason it was a problem in Darksiders is because there are 3 times as many combat encounters as any Zelda game, so it was kind of distractingly mediocre. So now we finally get to Darksiders 2. What has changed? Well, on the surface, the game seems pretty similar to the last one in terms of gameplay. You're still running around a big world and going to these various dungeons and solving a bunch of puzzles with the various tools that you find. But in reality, it actually plays nothing like the previous game. I'd say mostly in a good way because the combat has been vastly improved, which of course we're going to talk about first because this is one of my reviews. Gameplay is the most important part of any game, and combat is the biggest part of gameplay. If you played the first game, the first thing you'll notice is that Death controls far more fluidly than War ever did. And it kind of makes sense just given his character. War was like a walking tank. He didn't really need to dodge. You could block over half the attacks in that game and take 0 damage. Death is more like a Dex character instead of strength. He needs to dodge roll out of attacks, right? But he attacks much faster to make up for that. Death also has twice as many moves as War had, which on its own just makes the combat far more interesting as you mix together different attack strings and combos, and probably the biggest improvement of all is that you can swap between your primary dual scythe weapon and whatever secondary you have equipped in the middle of a combo, and it has a unique attack that is often pretty useful. The two-handed combo attack specifically is probably the most useful attack in the entire game, as you can quickly go from targeting one enemy to swinging your giant fuck you hammer and hitting every enemy around you, which is extremely useful on the higher difficulties, in which I would recommend you play this on Apocalyptic, which is hard difficulty, because normal is just too easy. Now, I have my own personal issues with Apocalyptic, mostly that they didn't really balance the damage enemies deal for massive groups. It's a very weird situation where boss fights are easier than normal enemy encounters in this game. Clearly that doesn't seem intentional. THQ Nordic should have balanced this shit out, especially since they've re-released the game as the Deathinitive Edition, which seems to be pretty buggy, but we'll get to that later. On top of having a pretty varied move set that changes based on what secondary weapon you have equipped, Death can also dodge roll 3 times instead of just the one awkward slide that War had, but as a consequence he can't block. I actually think that this game made a good choice in limiting the dodge roll. It doesn't cost any stamina or magic or anything to use, but if you dodge roll more than twice in a row, you get punished by the third dodge being a flip through the air, which you cannot cancel by attacking, unlike a normal dodge roll, and you're left vulnerable to being hit for about a second afterward, not being able to move in any way. So you can't just roll spam your way through this game. If you roll more than twice, you're gonna regret it. And just like the last game, you also have Wrath attacks, which are your special abilities which cost mana, called Wrath in these games, which you gain back by attacking enemies or using a mana potion. And that's one of the many notable changes in this game versus the last one. Instead of getting health and mana back from chests, like the God of War games, you instead now can carry up to 5 healing potions and mana potions. Now, on the one hand, I actually really like this because the healing potion does not heal health instantly, it heals it over time. So if you wait too long to use it, you're gonna get killed anyway. And it prevents you from being able to stack up a shit ton of potions together. You never get to carry more than 5 throughout the game. So if you're playing too well, the game's not going to reward you further for that. But on the other hand, I don't like this so much because the health potions dropping is RNG. And the developers knew that this might be a problem because they added a feature where you can fast travel out of dungeons and then fast travel back into exactly the spot you were just in. And this is clearly intended for you to warp to a merchant and buy health potions and then warp back in, because there's pretty much no other reason that you would ever warp out of one of the story mandatory dungeons. Now, if you're playing this on normal difficulty, it's probably never going to be a problem, but on Apocalyptic, there were several moments where the game would not drop healing potions, which is very frustrating and annoying when you warp out just to spend 5,000 bucks, which is fucking nothing by the midpoint in the game onward, just to warp back in. So clearly this system wasn't completely thought through. Now back to the Wrath attacks, I'd say pretty much all of these are useful, unlike the first game, where in Darksiders 1, you're pretty much just going to use a buff, and then the starting ability which summoned giant blades around you. You never needed anything else. Out of the 6 abilities, I'd say pretty much all of them are useful. But there is a clear winner here, in my opinion, that being the Swarm of Crows, because it's the only thing that can heal you outside of health potions and specific equipment abilities. And the Swarm of Crows only costs about a third of your Wrath bar, so I just ended up using the Swarm of Crows constantly. Although you can equip 4 abilities at a time, it's probably in your best interest to just pick 2, though if you don't like the abilities you upgraded, you can respec at any time for only 1,000 gold, which, like I said, is basically nothing. So the game encourages you to try out different stuff. My advice, just pick 1 ability for crowd control, and then pick one of the 2 buffs. That should carry you through the entire game. Another ability that returns from the previous game is the ability to go into your Chaos form. And this is basically just your win button. You take extremely reduced damage in this form, you might as well be invincible, and so you just get to beat the shit out of enemies for free for about 10 seconds, and that's more than enough to win any really challenging encounter. There's also a few other minor elements that occasionally play into combat, including your various puzzle-solving tools like your gun and this game's version of the hookshot are both situationally useful in combat. Not really worth explaining in detail. You can guess where a gun and a thing that can pull yourself to enemies or the other way around would be useful, obviously. And to bring something up that I put emphasis on in my original review, executions. They actually listened to a very common complaint in the first game that executions came up way too often, and there was only a handful of animations across the entire game. So instead, in the sequel, executions come up much more rarely unless you have a piece of gear equipped that increases execution chance. And there's also more executions total across all of the enemy types. Now the downside is, these executions are much less satisfying. There's almost no gore involved, maybe because many of the enemies in this game have no flesh, like rock constructs or skeletons. It's kind of hard to make an execution cool on enemies like these. And that about sums up the combat mechanics. It's nothing too complicated, really, but it feels good to hit enemies, you know? It doesn't really take much to please somebody if it just feels satisfying. You hit hard, your Wrath abilities really control the flow of combat well. I think especially the two-handed secondary weapons all feel great. They do noticeably more damage than any of the fast weapons. They can hit multiple enemies at a time, and specifically the charge attack on the glaives and the mace are extremely useful because they can send even medium-sized enemies flying, and mini-bosses can be stun-locked, which kind of just feels like breaking the game after a certain point. But that's exactly why you should want to play these games. You're supposed to feel like a god because the four horsemen are like demigods, essentially. So yeah, combat actually feels quite good this time, but combat mechanics are never the whole story. My first real problem with the gameplay comes from the loot system. This is now a loot game, and it's not a good one. I believe I've said many times on this channel, I don't like loot games. Even the ones with complex and arguably quite good systems, like the Borderlands games, where one gun can control completely different from another one in the same weapon class, just because it's made by a different manufacturer. But I hate games where loot feels like a fucking waste, where so much stuff is just complete useless garbage. This is not like Borderlands. The only difference between weapons is the additional stats beyond damage. And each rarity above white has an additional stat attached to it. So you'll have scythes that might give you wrath on hit or on a crit, or can life steal, or do fire damage, or have a higher critical hit percentage. And they're not tiny percentages either. Especially as you get further into the game, you can get a weapon that does 32% more critical hit damage. That's nothing to scoff at, right? But it still doesn't really translate into fun. And that's 90% of the loot in this game. Now, every single boss drops a unique weapon. Every one. And there's a lot of bosses. So I can praise this game for that. But if you're really attached to a certain weapon type, in my case, I just think the two-handed weapons are far more practical than the fast ones, especially when your scythes already are a fast weapon. There's no reason to double down. And you cannot switch out the scythes, by the way. You always carry scythes as your primary weapon. That means that a bunch of the boss weapons are completely useless to you. And another consequence of almost all the loot being random is that treasure chests feel far less rewarding. In the previous game, it was designed like Zelda, so treasure chests could have like a heart piece or a wrath shard, which would expand your wrath as you'd expect. Or maybe it would be a piece of the abyssal armor set, and even the shitty chests would give you souls, which were the currency. So every treasure chest was worth seeking out in Darksiders 1. In this one, you could skip a shit ton of them and miss nothing of value. It's hard to get excited over a rare loot drop when you know you're just going to out-level it anyway. It's going to become obsolete in a couple hours of gameplay. So the only piece of loot that is always useful are the possessed weapons, and that's like the highest random loot that can drop. And these weapons start with 0 properties like a common weapon, but you can sacrifice other weapons to it, and every time it levels up, it does more damage and gains an additional new trait. And so, they can be leveled up to 5 times, and they can have 5 traits, which is better than an epic weapon, right? So the possessed weapons are actually a really cool idea because you can customize them how you'd like. Now anyway, enough about loot mechanics. To get into the next problems with the gameplay, we have to talk about the general change in world design and the theme of this game. So we'll go into the story first. Like I said, Death wants to help his brother War, and he figures the best way to do so is to bring humanity back to life. And so he seeks out the Crow Father, who knows every secret, I guess, in the universe or some shit. We are told in the opening narration that the 4 horsemen are part of the Nephilim, a race created from both angels and demons combined. And they were too powerful, they threatened to overthrow the balance. And so, what would become the 4 horsemen betrayed their race, gained untold power from the council, and their first order was to wipe out all of the Nephilim. And so, once Death finds the Keeper of Secrets, we're told that all of the souls of the Nephilim were kept inside an amulet, which Death gave to the Crow Father. Of course, the Crow Father doesn't want to tell Death how to revive humanity, so you end up getting a tutorial boss fight against an avatar of War, which just shows you how much faster Death is than his brother, as War seems to have a 1-to-1 moveset from the first game. I thought that was a nice touch. And upon killing the Crow Father, a portal opens to the Forge Lands, and the amulet seems to break and fuses to Death's chest. So now he has the souls of all of his dead brothers and sisters infused into his body. Very edgy. In fact, this whole game seems to have stepped up the edginess a little bit from last time. I mean, just look at Death, dude. He looks like a character I would have drawn when I was 13 years old. He's got his double backhanded scythes, a skull mask to cover his face, long straight hair like a rock star, scars covering his withered, pale body, and the souls of the damned fused into his chest, representing the sins of his past. I really do like that edgy shit, and it actually works very well with the slightly comic booky art style they're going for in this game. They've clearly stepped up that stylized aspect from the last one, which is sort of like hybrid realistic and cartoony. From this point onward in the series, they would lean into that sort of Image or Dark Horse Comics style, and it's definitely a good look for this game. So the portal that opens up sends you to the Forge Lands, and this is where the game starts to take a nosedive. I really do not like the next 5 hours of this game. There's just something about the Forge Lands that doesn't fit with the Darksiders universe. As I just got done telling you how edgy this series is, we're then presented with a generic high fantasy forest with abandoned lost ruins and rock golem enemies. Does any of that sound edgy? No, it isn't. It's a little bit of a tonal whiplash. It's lacking any of that nice edge kino that Darksiders has. And honestly, a bigger problem is that out of those 5 hours, over 4 of them is spent inside dungeons, solving very simplistic puzzles, and fighting the same 3 enemy types for over half of the encounters. Seriously, I can't describe the Forge Lands as anything other than a slog. It feels way too stretched out for the lack of variety in its content. While only 4 of the dungeons are actually mandatory and there's a bunch of optional ones for side quests and just exploration, given that you're actually open to explore a mini sandbox for the first time in the series, you're probably going to explore around and discover that it's really ultimately just a waste of your time. Especially knowing the loot system, you're going to be outpacing any of the loot you'll find here anyway. But there's something about this landscape that's just boring. I know, it's purely a subjective thing. If you like the green and like abandoned ruins type of generic fantasy stuff, you'll probably like this. And it's not all bad. We get to see more of the Makers, which are giant dwarves. Yes, an oxymoron, I know, but that's essentially what they are. These huge buff humanoids basically built all of creation, but they're not God. There is a God. So I guess God created the universe and these guys built all the buildings and contraptions. It's not exactly that well explained. And somehow they're being wiped out by this mysterious force called corruption. And corruption turns out to be the main villain of this game. It seems like it's only affecting this world, but maybe because the Makers are separated from the rest of the universe, they're not aware of it, because you soon find out that no, this is something that threatens the entire fabric of reality. It's a big deal for something that never came up in the previous game. I guess they had to step up the stakes somehow. And obviously Death being an edgelord and kind of a smart-ass asshole and doesn't give a shit that the Makers are dying out, apparently, and corruption is wiping out everything. He just needs to get to the Tree of Life because he knows that will lead to the Well of Souls to revive all of humanity. And I'll admit, the writing for Death toes the line between being a smartass and just being a genuine asshole to everybody he meets, even people who want to help him.
Man of no words, your brother.
But hardly silent. His voice is the ring of the hammer and the roar of the white flame.
Yes, he works while you talk. Have you wisdom to share, or was it long since knocked loose in battle? You're different than the others. Less pleasant on the eyes, for one.
But on some level, it's understandable. As you'll see by the end of the game, everybody needs something before they're willing to help you, and it's usually something annoying and takes a great amount of effort for basically just some basic information. I just want to know how to fucking get into the Well of Souls, dickwad.
I must speak with the Lord of Bones.
That is not possible. My lord attends his realm, a burden beyond even your ken, horseman.
And what is your use as a doorstop?
Unfortunately, the way is being blocked by a huge corruption eyeball that, for some reason, is completely invincible. And so, Death has to make his way across the Forge lands, open up the Maker's huge forge, and travel into its temple and complete construction of a giant uncorrupted construct that can defeat the corruption. And yeah, like I said, this portion of the game is at least 5 hours long, more than that if you explore every inch of the map, and the enemy variety is just severely lacking at this point. Half of combat is the enemies you're fighting. When you fight the same fucking rock construct for the 100th time, it is not fun anymore. There's a few more enemy types in this section of the game, but they're more rare, and even they're just recycled enemies from the last game. Yeah, over half the enemies in this game were recycled from the first. That's not good, guys. That's really not good. So anyway, what ends up happening is you go through these various temples, and like I said, the temples themselves are not bad. If you're one of the people who missed classic Zelda dungeons playing Tears of the Kingdom, I would highly recommend you play Darksiders 1 and 2, and probably also Okami, because all those games do Zelda dungeons quite well. So at the end of each temple, there is a boss fight. That's another thing that I enjoy about this game. There's actually a lot of bosses. There's more bosses than there are basic enemy types in the Forge Lands, I think. None of the bosses are like super memorable, but they're like Souls games. You can just hit them. You don't really have to engage with a gimmick to defeat them, which generally I find bosses much more engaging that way. Once you fight your way through the Forge Lands, of course, the construct you're building gets corrupted because one of the hearts needed to power it has already fallen to corruption. So you have this big spectacle boss fight on horseback, which is the only one of its kind throughout the entire game. It's kind of weird that despite playing as one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, your horse is woefully underused. You only use it to get from point A to point B, with the exception of this very boss, and there's also no other gimmick boss like this throughout the entire game. This is just the end of Act 1, but in terms of pure spectacle, the game never reaches this point again. So after you defeat the construct, it looks like all hope is lost for how to clear the way to the Tree of Life. But the leader of the Makers sacrifices his life to purify one of the Power Stones, and the construct sacrifices itself to destroy the barricade. Once you get to the Tree of Life, Death discovers his journey is far from over. He needs to find the Well of Souls, where all of humanity's souls lie within, so that he can restore their lives. Instead, the Tree of Life is a sort of gateway between worlds. And as he passes through it, he finds out the identity of this corruption. It's Absalom, the leader of the Nephilim, who Death himself killed. And somehow, it's not explained, Absalom dissolved into this darkness as he died, which eventually became the corruption. And then we get another pure edge Kino moment as Death clearly regrets what he's just done. All the souls of his brethren enter his amulet, and he screams out,
The bitter victory could not be undone.
After this flashback, Death wakes up inside the Kingdom of the Dead, and we begin Act 2 of this game. And this is where the game steps up the edginess a little bit more again. I mean, yeah, it's the underworld. Visually, it's far more interesting than the generic green and gray of the Forge Lands. And in the Kingdom of the Dead, Death has to seek out its king, because apparently he knows how to get into the Well of Souls. But before you see him, you have to impress the Chancellor by fighting in the arena, which instead of being like an actual arena where you fight a series of enemies and then fight the big champion, is actually another Zelda dungeon. And after arbitrarily activating the arena, then you fight the champion and of course win. And so finally you get to see the King of the Undead, and of course he won't help you. No, you have to solve his personal problems first, in this case being his 3 undead lords have fled and refused to listen to him. And so you need to track them down in 3 more dungeons before he'll help you. Now this is where I began to notice another problem with this game. Like I said before, there's a lot of Zelda dungeons in this, but honestly there's way too many. Over half of this game takes place inside of a dungeon. In fact, probably 3/4 of it does. In Darksiders 1, it was sort of a 50-50 split. There were linear levels, and then there were dungeons at the end of those levels. There were also gimmick segments as well, where you'd ride a griffin and it was an on-rail shooter segment, or you were given a giant demon gun that you could shoot enemies with, so it was kind of like a third-person shooter. Darksiders 2 cuts out most of that. The core gameplay experience, that being the dungeon crawling, solving puzzles, grabbing loot, is basically 90% of this game. And for some people, that's not really a problem. In fact, usually I like games that just do one thing and do them extraordinarily well. A great example is Monster Hunter. You're doing monster hunting the entire fucking time. Except in the older games where you had to waste time farming shit or going on gathering missions, but I'm mostly referring to World here. And I'm not going to talk about Dragon's Dogma again, but I was thinking it. That's another game where it's really just the same gameplay the entire time. But Darksiders 2 isn't quite that compelling. Because there's so many Zelda dungeons, a lot of them don't actually stand out from one another. They don't really have temple themes outside of giving you a unique dungeon tool, but then they carry over a lot of the same puzzles, or at least the same type of puzzle, throughout various dungeons, and they don't really have a unique visual aesthetic either, like the Zelda games always have. So honestly, there's too many fucking dungeons in this game. If you love Zelda dungeons, that's great, but for me, this was too much of the same shit over and over again. So finally, after another few hours of dungeon crawling, you've retrieved the 3 undead lords, you return to the king, and he just straight up kills them in front of you.
What is this? I don't like being toyed with.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking the exact same thing during this cutscene. And guess what? The king actually doesn't even know how to get into the Well of Souls, but he sends you on your way to meet someone who does. But before he teleports you, he unlocks some of your true potential. As it turns out, the souls of the Nephilim can allow you to split into 2 versions of yourself. And I actually really like this item. This is one of my favorite Zelda-like tool items I've ever used in one of these games. Unfortunately, you can't control both at the same time, but you have to use Death's Stone Chaos form and these 2 soul versions of yourself to basically be in 3 places at once. And the game actually gets decently creative with this item. Without a doubt, the best puzzles in this game involve this ability, so kudos to the devs on that one. And it turns out you are taken to the City of the Dead, which, guess what? It's another Zelda dungeon! A city isn't a city, it's a fucking dungeon! This is the point where I actually got pissed off. Where we just got done doing 4 dungeons in the past 5 hours of gameplay, and guess what? We're given another dungeon to do. And when you finally make your way through it, the big boss at the end of the second act is this huge Cthulhu monster, and it's one of those shitty giant boss battles where his upper torso is leaning over a platform. Believe it or not, I actually talk shit about this type of boss battle in my first Darksiders review. These bosses are lazy, they're stupid. It's just a way of having a giant enemy boss battle, but you don't have to make it complex in any way. But as far as this type of boss goes, this was one of the best ones, which is not saying much. And after you defeat him, it turns out the guy who knew how to get into the Well of Souls all along was the Crow Father, and he's dead now because you killed him at the beginning of the game. And it's implied that this was all a part of his plan, because I guess he can see the future on top of knowing all these secrets, and he tells you that the only way inside the Well of Souls is within the Tree of Life, and to open that big gate, you need a key from heaven and one from hell. And so now you need to travel to 2 more realms to get those keys and end the game. Now this is where the game starts to feel very rushed. but in a good way, weirdly enough. Maybe because I was just starting to get tired of the constant dungeon crawling. But anyway, so you go off to heaven first, and there's no more sandbox. It's a straight line to Archon, one of these powerful angels, who is in charge of an outpost on the edge of angel territory, I suppose. And you learn from him that you need to go to Earth and gather 3 parts of this magic staff. And this was one of the best parts of the game, definitely, because you get some nice throwbacks to the first game. You get to meet Uriel, who is one of the main angels who wants to kill War over the course of the previous game. The whole level turns into a third-person shooter segment, which there were a couple in the previous game, but they're actually better in this one. And I will remind you that you do not have to shoot the enemies. You can fight them normally, drop the gun at any time. It's just that the gun clearly has higher DPS than any of your weapons, so there's not a real reason to. And once you return to Archon, he opens the way to the Ivory Citadel, just one light temple that felt quite well designed. And you fight your way to a really shitty boss at the end, a librarian, who ironically is one of the hardest bosses in the game because he spams a tentacle whip attack in a 90-degree cone in front of him that, while you can easily dodge, he spams every 3 or 4 seconds, meaning that you can't even hit him more than twice without having to dodge away from him again. Now, you do end up using the portal gun, which, yeah, they brought back the portal gun from the previous game. Like I said, Darksiders is incredibly derivative. There's very little original about this series in terms of gameplay. And you do use that portal gun to defeat the boss, which is kind of fun. And you learn from this fat-ass librarian that Archon betrayed you. He was corrupted the entire time, and so you get a really cool boss fight against him, one of the highlights of the game. You get his key, and now you must travel into the underworld to get the other half of the key. Now, this is where the game, without a doubt, blatantly felt rushed. If you thought the Heaven region was small, the Hell region is just a straight line and a dungeon. That's it. You go and meet Lilith, and the game is not exactly subtle about telling you she is the true villain of this series. Lilith created all of the Nephilim, so technically she is Death's mother, and she pleads to him to use the Well of Souls to bring back the Nephilim instead of all of the humans. And she has taken over Samael's region, and you'll remember him from the first game. He's the guy who's blatantly just Satan. And as you could probably guess, he's the one holding the other key. But he's not here. Where is Samael? Well, if you played the first game, you should know. He's been imprisoned on Earth by the Destroyer because he was too big of a threat. So Lilith gives you the ability to travel back in time for this final dungeon so that you can get the key from him. And this dungeon was only half as long as pretty much all the other story mandatory ones, so once again, adding to that whole rushed feeling. And when you finally confront Samael, somehow he knows that you've traveled back in time and have come of your own accord, not on orders from the council, so clearly he knows more than he's letting on.
But sometimes the hero dies in the end. Ask your brother. Careful, or your ending will be a tragic one. Sometimes the hero dies in the end.
And so you actually have a boss battle with this guy, which is great. He's one of the few bosses in this game with a genuine gimmick. He teleports around the arena attacking, so you gotta dodge at the right time. Nothing too complicated really, but about halfway through the fight, he starts summoning a bunch of circles of fire everywhere, and the spectacle aspect to it's pretty good. Better than the final boss, weirdly. And upon proving yourself to him, he decides you can take the key and destroy corruption. And so you're off to the final boss battle, and it's a disappointment. Imagine if Radagon was the final boss of Elden Ring with no second form. There's no Elden Beast. That would feel just a little anticlimactic, don't you think? This is no Lord Gwyn moment. He's not supposed to be easy and weak. I mean, shit, the final boss of the last game at least had 2 forms. Yeah, the first form was kind of a gimmick battle, but it's better than this. And after you finally defeat Absalom once again and let him die, Death is given the great choice whether or not to revive the Nephilim, his brothers and sisters, or to revive humanity and save his brother War. Of course, he chooses his brother over his fallen race, which is kind of a weird parallel to Last of Us, at least that's what I was thinking about as I was playing this again. And the game just sort of ends with another motion comics sequence where they re-explain the end of Darksiders 1, where War dies but the seventh seal is broken, so all of the horsemen are summoned together, and then roll credits. Though there is a post-credits scene which shows that Lilith is working for somebody else, who could be the real Satan or Lucifer. It hasn't been explained yet. And that wraps up Darksiders 2's story. Like I said, the stakes were clearly higher than the first game. We went from just trying to save Earth and save ourselves to now having to save our brother and also save the entire universe. And the thing is, even though there's a lot more characters in this game, there's more lore, there's more cutscenes, I gotta say the first game's story is definitely better. It felt more like a film. You had your key events, every cutscene felt necessary and had either some comedy or drama involved. This game has more of a tendency of dumping useless information on you. Yes, most of it is optional. In the dialogue tree, you can just back out. But even ignoring that, just the base plot of this corruption that rose up from the dead leader of the Nephilim just kind of comes out of nowhere. A universe-ending threat just kind of exists, because otherwise this story would have no tension to it, because we already know what happens in Darksiders 1, War saves himself. The game needed a villain, and they really did a bad job writing one. Absalom only shows up at the end of the first act and the very end of the game. Yes, his presence is felt throughout it, as corruption takes over many of the enemies that you fight throughout the game, but yeah, still not the greatest plot in the world. It's not terrible, but it also just kind of ends. The third act is obviously rushed, and that final boss fight was possibly even more so rushed, given how basic it was. It could have been any of the mini-bosses from the rest of this game. And that leads into my biggest problem with this game. It's too ambitious. It's pretty obvious to me that the heaven and hell sections of this game were supposed to be proper sandboxes, but that probably would have taken another year of development time, so instead we have these short linear sections. Something I didn't even bother mentioning is that there's a bunch of side content in this game, and I mean a lot. And the reason I didn't really talk about it is because none of it is any good. All of the side quests are fetch quests. You go to a place, you find a thing, or you go to a place, complete an optional dungeon, and maybe kill a mandatory boss, or find a thing. And there's several collect-a-thon side quests in this game, only one of which I bothered finishing, that being the Book of the Dead, because that one actually gives you pretty great rewards with each chapter that you finish and sell to Volgrim. You get some special loot, and a lot of generic loot in general too, so it's actually quite worth doing. The other stuff is straight up fetch quest garbage, and there's no locations on the map. You're going to use a guide to 100% this. It's just not feasible to do it on your own. If you want to waste 20 hours exploring every corner of this game, go ahead, but nobody's going to do that. The biggest examples of optional content that are basically completely pointless are the Arbiter's Maze and the Crucible. The Arbiter's Maze is 10 floors of fighting enemies where you have to pick a cardinal direction after you beat each wave in that room, and if you don't have the proper combo, then you just get lost forever. Well, they give you the combinations throughout the game that are slightly hidden and out of the way, just like all the other fucking collectibles. But this game came out in like 2012. They must have known people were going to use the internet. There's no reason to track down every page. And then for the Crucible, it's 100 floors of fighting progressively more difficult enemies. And this is just supposed to be the ultimate combat challenge. If you really like the combat in this game, then fight your way through every floor, I guess. There's really no other point at all, unless you want to get all of the achievements. So between the side quests, the collectibles, the optional dungeons, the game does justify having these 2 mini sandboxes, but I gotta say, they don't really add anything because of the random loot. If this game didn't have random loot and actually had life shards and wrath shards and whatever other permanent upgrade collectibles like a Zelda game would have, then this would undoubtedly be an improvement on the last game. But because of the random loot, you are free to skip all of these dungeons because the loot doesn't even really fucking matter anyway. Now, I did mention bugs before, and I'm actually re-recording this section because I found out on my New Game Plus playthrough that I had to do because I lost 4 hours of footage, which was completely my mistake, that almost all of the bugs I was experiencing are a result of playing the game at an unlocked frame rate. Now, you might be thinking, why would I play an old game on an unlocked frame rate? Well, the thing is, I did try turning on VSync because I figured a lot of old games do have problems when you play them at over 60 FPS. Well, it just doesn't fucking work in the Definitive Edition. There was actually one puzzle in the Light Temple that I actually couldn't complete because the physics were getting fucked up with the teleporters. So not knowing VSync didn't work, I locked the frame rate to 30, completed the puzzle, then just in case locked it to 60 afterward, and lo and behold, no more bugs. So just lock your frame rate in your graphics card software and you shouldn't have any problems. So in conclusion, is Darksiders 2 the superior game? I'm still gonna say no, guys. Doesn't mean I didn't like it. I did like it quite a bit. More than enough to complete the game, do most of the side content, and the combat is without a doubt a huge improvement, but combat isn't everything. I have always been a gamer that valued quality over quantity. I have despised sandbox games for like a decade at this point, and even though this is not a true sandbox game, it feels like one sometimes, that's for sure. And there is such a thing as too many Zelda dungeons, and this game has too many fucking dungeons. And only do you finally start getting reprieve from that in the last 3 hours of the game. And most of the dungeons are not memorable. The most rushed part of the game, aka the light and dark maps, have the two best dungeons because they have a unique aesthetic and a unique mechanic in each one. Your other tools that you get over the course of the game, the Shadow Hand, the splitting into 2 different souls, that stuff is reused across multiple dungeons, which makes them feel less unique. In the actual classic Zelda games, every single dungeon had a unique mechanic or just aesthetic period to them. You know, Water Temple, Light Temple, Dark Temple. I don't have to explain this really. In this game, there's like 10 decrepit stone temples and 10 skeleton temples. So yeah, on some level, I get it. I get why people like this game better, because the combat did suck in the first game. That is a concession I have made, but I think almost everything else about this game is a downgrade. I don't like loot mechanics. I don't think it drags down this game severely, but it was unnecessary. That said, I do like Death. I do like his grand quests. This game has a better sense of scale, and probably just a better plot, period, than the first game. But the first game overall is much more memorable. So, on the one hand, the game was slightly better than I remembered, but I still think Darksiders 1 is the best in the series. So I guess the question is, where did the series go from here? Well, several years later, and after THQ went under, many of you know that story, eventually THQ Nordic reformed from the ashes and bought back a lot of their sold-off franchises, including Darksiders. And so Darksiders 3 came out, and it was a Souls-like, and not a particularly good one. And then a couple years after that, Darksiders Genesis came out, which I never even played, and that was like a isometric dungeon crawler, like CRPG kinda. I don't even know if Darksiders as a franchise is still going. I don't think the sales were ever particularly spectacular, and the series is definitely not famous by any means, which is why I didn't feel bad explaining what it is in the beginning. So who knows if we'll ever get the final entry in the series, where the Four Horsemen come together and then defeat Hell and Lilith and all these secret forces behind everything and the council, and just wrap up the story in a nice bow. That's what I want to see, because I like the Darksiders universe. Please just make one final game, THQ. I'm begging you. Even if it's not even that good, I would like to see a franchise die with dignity for once. I don't know if I'm going to bother reviewing Darksiders 3 because I don't think people really like it that much. Feel free to tell me in the comments if you'd like to see that review at some point. And also, feel free to give suggestions for other game franchises I should come back to. Don't worry, I will come back to Ratchet, Jak, and Sly eventually. But as for some of the other series I covered in the past, feel free to throw some suggestions out there. Alright, I'll see you next time, guys.